So as Linda mentioned, the reason we're doing this, obviously we want to let people know what's going on with cure research. There's so much happening right now. We really think that's our responsibility as the community engagement coordinators for the Martin Delaney Collaboratory that are funded to do all this research, to make sure that we, inform the community of what's happening in real time, so people are up to speed. And once we're ready to start enrolling trials.
Jeff, I think you're muted.
Oh, that's weird.
Oh, I think, okay.
Here you go. Is that good?
Yeah, I think everybody got muted, including me. Sorry about that. So let me go ahead and share our slides, and I'll introduce our first speaker. So people can see those. Slideshow, yes. And play from start. So as Linda mentioned, this is the webinar series. And oh dear. So our first speaker will be Jules Levin, who really needs no introduction in this field. He has really pioneered the community activism and been a strong voice in making sure that this doesn't get ignored. Well, it is being ignored, but that it's being up there, and we're trying to change and move the needle, not only to get more research, but to get funding for that research. Jules is the founder and executive director of NATAP, the National AIDS Treatment Advocacy Program, and I'm sure we'll be showing at the end a lot of these seminars that he's got, the webinars that he's got coming up on this topic. So, Jules, I'll start the presentation and take it away.
So this is the title of the talk that I usually give, which is an hour long. Today it's 7 minutes. From promise to disappointment and despair, because in 1996, we thought 3-drug ART with protease inhibitor really was the solution for us. Little did we know that 10 years later, we were going to find that we were suffering accelerated aging, precipitating earlier death and morbidity. Older people with HIV face very uncertain futures, and we're faced with a broken HIV healthcare system left to navigate the situation. Next. As many of you know, as of a couple of years ago, the CDC reported, the CDC reported over 210,000 people over 60 years old in the United States with HIV. That was 5 years ago. It's projected by 2030, 70% will be over 50. In New York right now, and in San Francisco, 60% are over 50, 30% are over 60. And in New York, 80% will be over 50 by 2030. And probably in Palm Springs, it's the same numbers, right, Jeff?
Yeah.
Next.
Skews a little older.
Right. So people with HIV have higher rates of comorbidities. This is just one of many studies showing. In red are people with HIV, and you can see for every one of them, the higher rates of comorbidities, including heart attacks, kidney disease, cancers, and fractures. Next. These are some of the key important comorbidities associated with inflammation, diabetes, heart disease, cancers, cognitive problems, brain function, CNS, osteoporosis, frailty and physical function. These are the key ones, but there are so many comorbidities that older people without HIV have that we all with people with HIV have as well. Go back, please. And unsuppressed viral load and CD4 count are very much associated with higher rates of comorbidities and with mortality. Next, please. So key issues in the aging realm. Comorbidities increase death. Having more comorbidities increase death. Comorbidities are the leading cause of death in HIV. Fractures, cardiovascular disease, and frailty can increase death. Blacks and Latinos have higher rates by 3 to 4 times who are on Medicare with HIV, higher mortality rates and higher comorbidity rates. Women and Ys have worse adherence and worse outcomes and worse viral load suppression and higher rates of cognitive impairment. And older Black and Latino women with HIV have higher rates of diabetes and bone mineral density decline and osteoporosis and fractures. And detectable viral load and lower CD4 are associated with higher comorbidity rates and mortality. We're faced with a system that has ageism. It's ageism systemically in HIV care and research, and long-term survivors and perinatally acquired HIV in young adults are similarly a problem in this field. The difference is one of existentialism, which I'm going to show you. So this is just to show you what we are facing in terms of disability, an ACTG study where people are only an average of 51 years old, and to show you in the panel on the right some of the impairments of daily living activities that high percentages of people, only 51, faced, performing housekeeping, laundry, shopping, transportation, cooking. And the bottom left, a study from Meredith Green and at in her San Francisco Compass Clinic, 25% fall rates, depression 40%, 46% cognitive impairment, just to show you what we're dealing with. And an aging specialist who delivered a plenary at Croy, George Kuchel, said, these rates and issues that we're facing reflect accelerated aging. People with HIV are experiencing these 20 years earlier than people without HIV. Next. So this is just to show you two things. Number one, you see the lines on the top show people with HIV at higher rates of frailty, heart attacks on the right, and below that fractures. But more importantly is the concept that if you look at people past 50, the slope of the rates for people with HIV increased much more quickly than people without HIV, showing you what I was talking about, that this becomes one of existentialism for people over 50, where they start to have immunosenescence, which Dr. Landay will talk about, and that's when they start really facing disability and increased mortality. Next. This is a study that was presented several years ago at Croy from Kaiser Permanente, a very large healthcare system, showing 9 years difference in mortality between people with HIV and without HIV. Next. So what's causing all this? Well, Dr. Landay is going to talk about immunosenescence, so I'll not get into that. But these are some of the things that's causing the problem, including ART toxicity, low nadir CD4, lifetime trauma, mitochondrial toxicity, and history of injection drug use is a factor as well. Immune dysfunction and depletion. Next. So just recently, as a result of a letter that a bunch of us in New York State from a committee, New York State committee I sit on, we sent to the leadership in New York State telling that they're just not doing enough. They issued these new updated guidelines. The problem with the guidelines is that they have no teeth. Doctors don't have to follow guidelines, and they won't without additional funding. Next. So this is what we're all facing. It's not just comorbidities, it's depression, it's anxiety, it's feeling abandoned, it's income, it's housing problems, it's stigma, social isolation, and poverty. Next. So lastly, what's the answer here? We need new models of care. The Ryan White Care Act is failing us. We are over 50% of the population and soon to be 70% of the population. The Ryan White Care Act needs to be restructured and redesigned to meet our needs. We need personalized, geriatric, integrated care. This is a global movement asking for this, not just us. We need to structure care in the clinic to meet the needs of this aging population. And we need prevention for long-term survivors and perinatally acquired young adults with HIV as well. And that's it. Thank you. Did I make 7 minutes?
You did, Jules. You were amazing on time. So
Fabulous,
didn't have to wait on time cop. So we'll stop sharing. And just as a reminder, we're going to keep going through all 4 of the presentations. And then if you have any questions, please enter those in the chat or save those. And we're trying to allow plenty of time at the end for Q&A and discussion, because I'm sure there'll be a lot that comes up. So Dr. Serena Spudich is our next speaker. She's from Yale and is a neurologist and research investigator whose specific focus and passion is the brain and healthcare of people living with HIV. So Dr. Spudich, welcome and take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And it's a tough act to follow, Jules, in any setting. I've learned so much along the years from Jules and many other people, but in particular, that was a terrific talk. I've also really enjoyed reading the comments in the chat. It's just wonderful to hear how many people from all over the place are joining and even sharing a little bit about their histories and why this topic is important to them. So always inspiring and instructional to communicate with everyone, and it's really great to be here. So I am a neurologist, so I'm basically a doctor that's trained to take care of people, the health of people's brains and the nervous system, including the nerves and the muscles. And ever since I was a medical student, which was at UCSF, and so in San Francisco, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I have really been committed to taking care of people who are living with HIV and really trying to improve their brain health. Again, this is an area that is obviously of utmost importance to every single one of us, is how we can think, how we have our memories, how we can keep our personality, how we can continue to function. And that does interplay with many of the other speakers today in terms of frailty, in terms of inflammation. But I'm going to talk most practically about concerns of people who are living with HIV and aging in terms of their cognition, sort of your memory, your ability to concentrate, your ability to do the kinds of things that you like to do, and touch also on mental health. And I'll say that as a clinical doctor taking care of people living with HIV for the last 25 years, for the first 10 years or so of that, many of the people that I took care of were in their 30s and 40s. They were having lots of problems related to problems with not necessarily being on fully functional antiretroviral treatment. We're having lots of infections and those kinds of complications. But the vast majority of people that I care for today in my clinic here in New Haven, Connecticut, are people who are over age 50 or 60 who are coming with more subtle problems. So not necessarily a big infection in the brain, but having problems with their memory or their concentration. They're feeling like their personalities have changed a little bit, and difficulties with doing some of the functions and the kinds of things that they used to enjoy. And many of these patients come in with their partner, with a family member, or even by themselves, or even referred by their primary care doctors who have known them for so long, saying, gosh, something's changing with me, or something's changing with my partner, or something's changing with my husband. And so I think that what we're all faced with now is this question of whether people who are aging with HIV have a new problem that's developing related directly to HIV, whether or not they have a new problem that's developing that is not at all related to HIV, because as we age and we are susceptible to all the other kinds of things that everyone without HIV can get, including types of dementia, things like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or other things that happen that are much more typical when we get over the age of 60. And the other thing, of course, is that there are some things that are reversible that can cause problems with memory and thinking and concentration. And so really understanding what's at play when someone comes in and says, gosh, doc, I'm having trouble with my memory, is something to really think about carefully. And I'll say that one of the things that I've learned, and I think a lot of research has shown, is there's not one size fits all. So not everyone who's aging with HIV over age 60 has the same issue. First of all, many people don't have problems with their memory or their thinking, and they're continuing to work and be active and do lots of really important things. But people who do have these concerns, we have to look very carefully at trying to help people figure out exactly what's in front of them and what we can do about it, right? So I wanted to talk about a couple of things people have probably heard of or know people who have had what we call HIV dementia. That's really a problem that we used to see much more frequently in the old days when people didn't have access to medications, when medications weren't effective, and when basically we had a lot of complications of more severe HIV disease. And we very, very rarely see anyone with what we call dementia. Dementia is really an inability to sort of take care of yourself, do daily functions, dress, clean, bathe yourself, etc. We hardly ever see that anymore, unless somebody has sort of fallen through the cracks. and maybe gone off their medications or been unable or had a very late diagnosis of HIV. So unfortunately, we still see in the US and worldwide. But what's much more common is something that is referred to as mild cognitive impairment. And that's actually a term that was developed for Alzheimer's disease or mild impairment in Alzheimer's disease. But it's something that I think also refers to the kinds of symptoms some people have who are living with HIV. It's maybe just some little bit of difficulty with remembering things that they used to be able to remember easily, more forgetfulness about what they're doing around the house, or maybe sometimes leaving on the stove, getting a little bit lost while driving. Those are things that are more subtle. That's not dementia, but that's something that some people who are living with HIV experience. And what we need to do is try to figure out whether that's due to something related to their HIV, whether it's due to something, again, like a new condition like Alzheimer's disease, or whether it's due to some other kinds of reversible treatable factors. And what I'll say is that a lot of research has been done looking at whether or not the brain is healthy in people who are on fully suppressive therapy. And I think you'll hear a little bit more about inflammation later in this presentation. And there is evidence that there's a little bit of inflammation in the brain, even when people are on great treatment. So that might be contributing to some of these cognitive changes. However, there is a possibility that people could have a new condition. And this is why it's important to see a doctor who's a specialist in memory to help evaluate whether there could be a new condition such as Alzheimer's disease. And typically that diagnosis is made by an evaluation and some clinical tests. The final thing is whether there's something potentially reversible happening. And I'll say that one of the key reversible factors in people who have memory problems is depression and mental health issues. And that is something that if it can be identified, again, by seeing your primary care doctor, maybe referration to a specialist, that is something that can be reversed by treatment, by therapy, biofeedback, mindfulness, etc. And oftentimes you can see a great improvement in cognition in that setting. And the other thing I'll say is that there are other reversible causes of memory impairment, including hearing loss, including treatment of things like hypertension. People can have improvement, and even something like exercise. So there are things that we can do. But I would say that if you're interested in this area and concerned about this area, talk to your primary care doctor, potentially get referral to a specialist, like a memory disorder specialist. And finally, if you're willing, get involved in research studies and get involved in community advisory boards, because these are the kinds of questions that are increasingly important to the community. And there has to be a lot of partnership in being able to answer and ask these questions properly. And I'm an investigator and researcher. I run clinical studies with patients and participants, and it's really meaningful to have a lot of engagement from the community to answer those questions. So that's my sort of brief overview, and I'm really excited about the panel discussion. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Spudich. That was incredible. And thank you for mentioning, what people can do and including joining advisory boards. I know the ACDG is in desperate need of people to join their community scientific subcommittee. And this is where a lot of this research is going to be happening. So if you have an interest in this, reach out to me or Jules or someone, and we can tell you how to apply, because we don't have enough people from the US willing to do this work anymore. And it's our advocacy that'll make it happen. So thank you again. So next up is Dr. Alan Landay from Rush University in Chicago, who's been doing HIV research for 42 years and has extensive experience in aging-related studies. He's co-investigator of an R33 grant that integrates efforts of the Centers for AIDS Research, Older American Independent Centers, and Shock Centers. He's participated in the Office of AIDS Research and HIV Aging Committee and has been an advisor to the UN AIDS on HIV and aging. He's currently co-investigator on HIV and aging studies in Brazil and is helping to establish some infrastructure there as well. So welcome, Dr. Landay, and let me pull up your slides and we'll proceed.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a real privilege to be here today, if you could put those. And I really appreciate the effort of the community to do this. As Jeff said, I've been doing this for a long time. As you can see from my titles, I'm an immunologist by training. I did my first studies in Birmingham, Alabama in 1981, studying hemophiliacs with a new disease. We didn't even know about a virus back in 1981, but I was studying the immune system, and I've continued to do that for my whole career. And I'm now actually in the Department of Medicine at Rush in the Division of Geriatrics, which gives me, I think, a really important new perspective of how to deal clinically with HIV and aging from an integrated view from the HIV world and geriatrics. Next slide. So as you can see, we'll just go to this slide because I think a number of the comments were already made by Jules in his really important introductory slide about all of the effects of aging-related comorbidities. We're dealing with all the organ systems in the body. So when we think about aging, when we think about inflammation, we have to think about the organ systems. Serena just told us about the neurocognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment, and the importance of the brain. We also know about diabetes and inflammation. We're looking at aspects of the lungs, kidneys, the liver, and bone disease. And then also as an integrated role, we look at gerontologic outcomes, especially measures of frailty. And this gives us a great opportunity as we're thinking about clinical trials and intervention, how we can look at the whole person. And that's really about where we are globally in person-centered care. We have to look at the whole person today in our HIV and aging aspects. And I know the International AIDS Society has a whole effort globally to think about person-centered care that I'm involved in to ask questions about aging on the global side. Next slide. So where there is importance is of overlap between the questions of aging in the gerontologic sense and those between HIV. We're now looking at this question of senescence, or as we think about it, more about immune senescence. And it's important then that we think about all the aspects and drivers of aging. We talked just in Serena's talk on stress and trauma. We know there's an important differentiation between chronologic and biologic age. We're looking at some newer concepts. So you might be 50 years in age by your chronologic age, but biologically, you might be 60 years of age. And now we have new tools in the laboratory to define your biologic age. We're looking at these new important areas of using biologic clocks of aging, and we can now measure this on cells from people, and we're incorporating this in our clinical trials and our potential evaluation of individuals. We're also importantly socioeconomic lifestyles we've heard about. Co-infections are critical, and as we think about the global aspects of aging, we have to look beyond just HIV along with co-infections with tuberculosis, malaria, hepatitis, and dengue and other arboviruses. So there's a critical role globally. And also importantly, we're looking at CMV as another co-infection in aging. And all of this together, we look at the biologic questions, especially in the center here of inflammation, the mitochondrial damage, and that could happen based on the drugs you've had over your lifetime. We know that certain drugs have caused mitochondrial damage, and we're now studying those more effectively. And not only are we looking at genetics, but epigenetics. What are those effects on the DNA methylation and things that can occur from the environment? That's your epigenetic effects. How does the environment affect aging is so critical. Next slide. And we talked about inflammation, inflammaging. What are the contributors? Well, HIV itself can be a major factor, and we're studying that by looking at how we intensify our therapies. We're also looking at other HIV-related immune dysfunctions of both the innate, which is the things like natural killer cells or monocytes, and the adaptive immune system. I mentioned the impact of the therapies, and the earlier therapies would have more effects on our immune aging, maybe less so than our current therapies like integrase inhibitors, and we'll also be looking more at long-acting therapies. We know that there's been an important role for the gut, and we also think about, we can talk more about what role does the gut play as you age, and this idea that your microbiome changes over aging and also by HIV. We know about co-infections that I've mentioned, especially CMV, and we're now targeting CMV in our ACTG trials to see if that is an additional factor beside HIV that will contribute to aging and inflammation. Lifestyle factors, which are clearly modifiable, smoking, alcohol use, drug use, can all be contributing to chronic inflammation. And then basically the underlying mechanisms of aging also are there. Next slide. So we've moved into a whole new field now of geroscience, the science of aging. And this is a new field of study at the NIH. We're now incorporating this into all of our thinking of HIV and aging. Just recently, the NIH held its 4th summit on geroscience, and this is an area of interest to all 27 institutes at the NIH. And we're now incorporating this into all of our thinking in HIV as we look at questions of inflammation, also damage like mitochondria, and stem cell dysfunction. All of this can lead to the phenotypes of aging, like the geriatric syndromes, which you'll hear more about from Dr. Erlandson, like sarcopenia and frailty and cognitive impairment, which you've heard about from Dr. Spudich. We also know about other chronic diseases that are important. And then finally, decreased resilience. This is a really important term, resilience. How well do you respond to a insult? How well do you respond after you've had a fall? When you go in the hospital, how well do you bounce back after those? And this is what we're incorporating in all of our aging studies in terms of resilience at the person level, but we're also doing this at the laboratory level as well. Next slide. And what we're saying now is senescence a final common pathway. Is this something that we can study from what we do as a basic biological studies in the laboratory and with our patients to look at the genetics, to look at the immune cells, and ultimately show that we're inducing these senescent cells and they're making the senescent associated secretory phenotype. These are the inflammatory mediators of aging that occur during healthy and normal aging, but also may be accelerated or accentuated in HIV, and ultimately will lead to the comorbidities we're now seeing, not only during normal aging, but maybe as we talked about and Jules highlighted so eloquently, in our aging population as well. Next slide. And then what we want to do is consider HIV in our geroscience guided approaches. Ultimately, we want to be able to include what we've learned from aging now in how we're treating our HIV patients, especially as we're looking at this in our cure strategies. Next slide. And then finally, there are new areas of therapeutics in the aging called cynotherapeutics. These are actually new agents or even old agents. We're looking back at agents that things like are metformin used for diabetes, and we can now repurpose these drugs in our aging studies, and also rapamycin used in our transplant patients, or dasatinib used in cancer. All of these are drugs that have been used previously. We're now using these to study in aging, and as well, we're looking at many of these drugs to see how they can impact the HIV reservoir. So in summary, we've got a tremendously number of new tools, new approaches, and things that we can really do to now test the questions of how can we help our aging HIV populations in the cure research area, and even more broadly for their aging comorbidities. Thank you, and I look forward to the questions and discussion.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Landay. That was a great overview of what's going on there. And next up is Dr. Kristine Erlandson from the University of Colorado. She's an infectious disease clinician and researcher, and her research is primarily focused on improving the physical function of adults with HIV and other infectious diseases as they age. So let me bring your slide up and take it away, Dr. Erlandson.
Thank you, Jeff. And this is such an exciting chance to talk about HIV and aging. And I'm really impressed at the size of this group. It's great to see so much enthusiasm. So as Jeff mentioned, my research focus is on physical function and frailty. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about why I think this is such an important issue that we think about in the context of aging with HIV and specifically cure research. So next slide. So what is physical function? I think physical functioning refers to someone's ability to do their daily activities. And this may vary quite widely depending on the person. Could be a very fit person where we're describing how fast someone can walk or how fast they could run a race. It could be looking at someone's balance or flexibility, or even their ability to get up from a chair or to get from a chair to a bed. Alan mentioned frailty. I think frailty is a similar concept and really refers to how vulnerable someone is to stressors. So someone who's frail may be much more likely to end up hospitalized if they have pneumonia or another illness, or maybe someone who is hospitalized is much more likely to need assisted living or skilled care after a hospitalization and less likely to bounce back and be able to go home. Frailty is measured by a lot of different definitions that I won't get into in detail today, but I just wanted to present that overall concept. So next slide. In the research setting, and sometimes in clinical settings, we can use very specific and standardized tools to measure someone's function. Some clinics in several of our research studies look at how fast someone can walk. The picture on the left shows the example of someone doing a 4-meter gait speed test. So walking from one cone to the other, it's about 13 feet. We just measure how fast they can walk at a normal pace. The figure in the middle shows how fast someone can get up from a chair without using their arms. And this is a great measure of of lower leg power. So how well can someone actually stand up? Very functional measure, something people do every day. And it's a great test to really see how someone's doing. And then the figure on the right shows someone having their grip strength measured using a handheld dynamometer. And this is something that we use in several of our research studies. Next slide. So why is physical function so important? Well, first, someone's physical function is strongly associated with how long they might live. Just for example, just something as simple as how fast someone can walk across 4 meters or 13 feet across the room, like I showed in that prior figure, can provide a very strong predictor of the years of life someone has remaining. So take, for example, someone who's 70 years old, on the figure on the right, that top arrow, if they have a gait speed of 1.6 meters per second, which is walking at about 3.5 miles in an hour or 3 miles per hour if you walk on the treadmill, that person's expected to live another 30 years. In contrast, if you take someone who has a gait speed of 0.2 meters per second, which is equivalent to about 0.5 miles per hour or walking about a half a mile in an hour, that person likely only has about another 10 years of life remaining. So just something as simple, free, something we can do in clinic, really easy to measure test of something people do every day, which is walking, can really provide a great measurement on how well someone's living and how much life expectancy they have left. As Jules highlighted in his introduction, we definitely do see greater physical function impairment that occurs at an earlier age in people aging with HIV compared to those without HIV. And in both populations of people with and without HIV, we know that physical function is a major predictor of how long someone can live at home independently before they might require assisted care at home or a skilled nursing facility or somewhere else to live. We know that physical function impairments are strongly associated with things like falls and fractures, which may then lead someone to need additional care at home. And we also know that some of these physical function impairments, like gait speed, ability to stand up from a chair, are associated with a higher risk of developing other comorbidities, perhaps neurocognitive impairment, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes, both in people with and without HIV. In fact, with all of this information, many people, particularly in the geriatric world, have proposed that adding something as simple as a measure of gait speed might be more informative than those vital signs that you have checked in clinic when you go in, like your blood pressure and your heart rate. Next slide. So Jeff asked us to talk a little bit about what some of these concepts might mean in the context of cure research. And I wanted to touch on 2 important concepts here. So first, I think one of the important things to consider is what is the impact of an intervention, a cure intervention potentially, on something like physical function or frailty. So if we're giving an intervention to an older adult, is this a fairly toxic intervention that may actually cause more harm? Or is there potential for benefit in this person? So what is the impact of some of these senolytic or cure strategies on physical function? And do we think that it might improve the quality of life and improve the life expectancy of people aging with HIV? And for an older adult, this improvement in life quality or in quality of life may be much more important than actually curing HIV. But I think that becomes an important question for the community and something that we certainly need ongoing input. And I think the second question that's important for physical function and cure is whether physical function or frailty might change how someone responds to an intervention. So if we're giving an intervention to someone who's very frail, bedbound, that may be somebody who really isn't going to respond to anything. We may be kind of past the point where that person may have a response to an intervention. or maybe that's the person that really needs an intervention. And so I think considering which populations are going to benefit the most and which populations are likely to have a benefit may be particularly important when we're thinking about who gets enrolled in intervention studies for cure or for some of these other cure strategies. Next slide. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that these are certainly issues that we're facing right now. There are ongoing studies looking at medications for cure that may also have an impact on physical function. For example, Alan touched on dasatinib and quercetin. There is an ongoing study using this combination of drugs. Dasatinib's a cancer drug, and it has been shown to have some anti-senolytic properties, so it might remove kind of those old aged cells. There's a study that is in development in the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, or the ACTG, looking at dasatinib and quercetin for a cure or for decreasing the HIV reservoir. And there are several studies in the geriatric population using this same drug in a lower dose and a different dosing frequency, but using these same treatments, looking at geriatric outcomes, things like physical function and frailty, that actually show some promising data. And because of that, the AIDS Clinical Trials Group is also looking to develop and in the process of developing a study to look at this combination of therapy on physical function and frailty in older people with HIV. Alan also mentioned, or one of his tables included metformin. It's a common diabetes drug. It's very low cost in comparison to dasatinib. And there is some data suggesting that metformin also may decrease some of these senolytic cells, as well as decrease HIV reservoir in people with HIV. And so there are studies looking at physical and cognitive function with metformin, and whether this might change frailty or improve physical function in people without HIV, but fairly limited data in HIV. So overall, I think the community's inputs on the types of studies, the populations of people that are enrolled, who's willing to enroll in these studies is extremely important. And I look forward to discussing some of these issues in the rest of today's meeting, as well as in future sessions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Erlandson, and all of you. These were great presentations, and thank you for powering through them as quickly as we did. I know there's a lot of data here. And again, just to reiterate why this is so important in the cure arena is that a cure, they've been saying for 20 years now, is 10 years off, and that may still be the case. So by the time we actually get a cure, we can start testing and then administering to people living with HIV, everybody's going to be old, right? Everybody's already over 50 now, more than half. And it's just going to increase over time. So it's really important that those of us involved with cure research really look at the research and make sure it's applicable to the people who need it the most, and the majority of people there are. So I know my colleagues have been helping me track some of the questions that have come up in the chat. So if we want to take a couple of those, and then if you have any more, please either put them in the chat or use the raise hand feature to raise your hand, and you can ask your question online. So
there was a question from Jim Pickett about the PrEP toxicity and how that may affect HIV and aging.
Anybody want to take that one on?
Hey, this is Jim. I just want to clarify that question. It was in one of the slides. It said it was an issue. A PrEP toxicity was listed as a potential issue for people aging with HIV, and I just didn't understand how PrEP fit into the aging with HIV paradigm.
I'm not sure whose slide it was, but I can start an answer to that one. I think that PrEP, or specifically TDF, may have some data on mitochondrial toxicity. I think that's still kind of an ongoing area of how much mitochondrial toxicity TDF may cause, particularly in comparison to other drugs. And there may be some risk, as many of you know, of osteoporosis or of renal disease. Although the studies in PrEP in younger healthy participants really haven't shown that much toxicity, I think it certainly does raise some questions for what might be the long-term impact of those in people without HIV who are taking treatments for many, many years. Whether they do take them for many years, I think we haven't seen that much PrEP yet to know what the long-term course of PrEP will be. But that may cause some aging considerations in people who don't have HIV. As Alan mentioned, though, there's so many other things that might be unique to people with HIV that people on PrEP may not have. such as inflammation and ongoing virus replication. And so we may see less of those toxicities in that uninfected population. We don't know yet.
And maybe I'll follow up just with a comment about ART itself. So one of the things that's been long a concern is whether or not, certain types of antiretroviral therapies may worsen brain aging or some of the cognitive issues of people who may be living with HIV on treatment. And, there's been a lot of data that has suggested that certain medications, such as efavirenz, can make people have sort of a brain fog, and that can be reversible when people stop that therapy. And there had been some concerns also about the integrase inhibitors, for example, dolutegravir, potentially causing cognitive or psychiatric effects. And we've just completed a large study through the AIDS Clinical Trials Group that took people who were on suppressive treatment and were doing well on suppressive treatment, but had some cognitive issues, and intensified their treatment. We randomized them to getting intensification with different medications, and one of those included dolutegravir. And we didn't see any bad effects of dolutegravir on cognition or on mood measures. So that was very reassuring to us that at least in terms of people who are already well suppressed on treatment, switching or adding to dolutegravir doesn't seem to have bad effects.
How many people were in that study?
Like 180, 185.
Is
It was
that
a very
published?
intensive study because people had to be screened to have cognitive impairment and then have long-term follow-up. But I think it didn't show an improvement in cognition with treatment intensification, which was what we were hoping for, but it also didn't show any bad effects of treatment intensification.
Is that data reported or published yet?
Jules, it just was published last week. I'll send you the link.
Okay.
It just came out in CID.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we had a question from Brenda Chambers, but she put her hand down. So I didn't know, Brenda, if you had a question still that you wanted to ask.
I do. I just wanted to find out. Now, you said something about hearing loss with memory problems. And that had me wondering, so does hearing loss and memory problems show something?
Yeah, I'll take that one too, because I know I'm the one who mentioned it. It absolutely does. It turns out that if people have hearing loss, they are more prone to progress to having memory problems. And it's probably related to a couple of things, partially social withdrawal, that if they really can't hear well, then they tend to avoid social situations. They don't converse with other people as much. And in fact, also, you basically, a lot of what keeps your brain active is by taking in information and processing it in your brain. And if you have poor hearing, then actually part of your brain actually kind of stops working as well if you don't stimulate it with good hearing. So one of the preventable causes of dementia, even in people without HIV, is treating hearing loss by, for example, getting tested for hearing loss and getting hearing aids that work and using them. And that's been highly recognized in all aging populations. So it's not proven for people living with HIV, but I can't imagine it's any different.
Okay,
Serena, can I go back to that intensification study real quickly before we get off of that
Sure.
subject?
Yeah.
For a long time, there's been a question in my mind, at least, and I know other people's, about, is it the drugs? Is it the HIV? Is it both? So, I'll be interested to see once Jules gets that study and sends it around, what drugs were used for how long and whatever. So if there is if you were able to tease out whether it's the drugs have any effect on cognitive impairment.
Well, thank you so much, Linda, for that question. And I think that, the whole goal of that study, it was pretty ambitious. It was trying to answer kind of completely whether really getting drugs that penetrate better into the brain could actually benefit cognition. But we also had the question of whether there might be some problems of getting a lot of drugs into the brain. And so we took people who were not on these particular drugs. The drugs that were used were dolutegravir and maraviroc. We know those both penetrate the brain, and we thought that we may see a benefit of giving those medications. And so we randomized people to getting one or both of those added or nothing added. We can't really answer the question whether any of the medications have an effect, because these are all people who are already on medications. But I will say that there's an interesting study that's been conducted in Sweden of people who are not living with HIV but are on PrEP. They didn't do cognitive testing, but they did find some sort of levels of inflammation actually in the fluid that surrounds the brain in people on PrEP compared to people who are not on PrEP. It's not clear whether that's because of the meds or it's because of other lifestyle factors and other things about those people who are on PrEP. But that may be one way to answer the question of how the medications affect the brain. And probably more studies like that should be done.
Thank you.
So we did have a hand up from Nancy, but I see that she put it down. I don't know if Nancy, you still had your question that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I was just going back to the hearing loss. I don't necessarily have hearing loss, but I've had tinnitus in my left ear for about a year and a half or so. Does that affect memory?
I don't believe that should affect memory. It would only affect memory if it, prevented you from going out and socializing and spending time with people, and if it started to interfere with your hearing because of the ringing. But otherwise, no, it should be unrelated.
Thank you.
And we also had
a question to that, if I may. Anecdotally, we hear a lot about tinnitus and people living with HIV. Is there any data around this? Is it more common?
I am embarrassed to say I don't actually know the data on that. I'm sure that work has been done and I'll look into it. I mean, certainly I agree with you. I have a lot of study participants and patients who have mentioned that, but actually tinnitus is common actually in the general population as we age. So I just don't know if the frequency is different in people living with HIV.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Daniel, you have your hand up. Would you like
Yes,
to
sir.
ask?
Thank you very much, everyone, for the presentation. I'm completely overwhelmed and want to do more intense research myself with geroscience, especially Dr. Alan Landay was just really impressive. So much information. My basic question is concerning avascular necrosis and ART therapy, and also is that related to a comorbidity issue that's prevalent in people that are living with HIV as opposed to people that are not living with HIV?
So specifically with avascular necrosis, I think that we haven't seen as much avascular necrosis now as we did back in the earlier days without antiretroviral therapy or in the setting of older antiretroviral therapy. I mean, certainly there is still a risk of it. I can imagine that in addition to osteoporosis may cause even more risk for fractures. I think, is that your question? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yes, that's my question, because I'm just trying to figure for myself personally. I think there are a lot of personal questions coming from people that are living with HIV that are part of this entire presentation that need to be answered, because maybe we don't have them answered through our medical professionals or through advocacy or so. But so I'm someone that has avascular necrosis, and I was just wondering what role my HIV or living with HIV and the medications I have may have played in that particular thing, because I don't have let's just say the standard reasons behind experiencing avascular necrosis. People say that's alcoholism, so on and so forth, some of those things. And I have not had those experiences except for the osteopenia and osteoporosis that's possibly linked to maybe ART toxicity.
Yeah, no, I think we definitely have seen more avascular necrosis in people with HIV. So I think there is reason to suspect that it could be linked.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
We have another question about is there a correlation between the number of HIV medicines and cognitive issues? Like is it different between someone who's on 1 pill per day versus 9 pills per day?
Yes. Some of us are taking as many as 16 pills a day. There's no question there's a correlation. Also because if you're taking more pills, that means you probably have more comorbidities like diabetes or heart disease. So there's an association with more comorbidities and with more pills, more polypharmacy, and with cognitive impairment. And sometimes Dr. Erlandson and Dr. Landay may want to comment on that. We know that a lot of these pills, extra pills people are taking for medications, like some of the antidepressants, can cause cognitive impairment and cause falls. And people can fall as a result. Some of these medications people should not be on. And we call that de-prescribing, stopping some of the medications.
Yeah, exactly. I think that there's a lot of data both in people with and without HIV of the potential impact of polypharmacy or taking more than 5 medications. And it can certainly have negative impacts on cognition, on other health problems. There can be drug-drug interactions between different medications. It can impact people's gait speed and fall risk for sure. So certainly there's medications that have benefit. And so I think it's important to not go home and stop all medications. It's more of a which ones have potential risk and which ones have more benefit, and just reviewing those with the primary care provider or specialist to say, do I need this medication? And is it actually leading to a benefit, or is it something I could potentially stop?
Angel, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, good afternoon to all, and this is to all the presenters. Can you talk a little bit about the effects on aging and long COVID?
With HIV or unrelated to HIV?
Yes, with HIV, long-term survivors and effects. I know long COVID is a new field, but can you talk about a bit around aging, especially about your issues on physical function and frailty?
Serena, did you want that one?
Well, sure. I'm happy to talk about that one. I mean, we've been studying long COVID. We've been studying cognitive effects of HIV, and now I actually have a study in one of my HIV cohorts specifically to study long COVID in that cohort. So hopefully we'll have some answers to some of these questions. I would say that there are, if the question is sort of what's the intersection between these, I think that they are different. I think people experiencing long COVID symptoms do have some overlap symptoms as people living with long-term treated HIV, but it's not all the same. And I also think that there's not really great data that I know of that definitely proves that people who are living with HIV are at greater or less risk of long COVID. And I'd be interested to hear of whether anyone else on the call has more information about that. I think that's something that cohort studies will be hopefully revealing, but it will take a while, I think, to parse that data. And some of the long COVID studies that have been published to date have not indicated whether they have people living with HIV in their cohorts. So I don't know a lot of the data. I would say that long-term treated HIV is associated with clear inflammation, as you heard from Dr. Landay. It's associated with effects that seem to be, of course, long-lasting. Long COVID, we're having a really hard time in the field identifying severe inflammation, identifying virus. I think it is a different entity, but there may be some overlap. Is that an answer to the question?
I'd like to add, we are studying this with Dr. Annie Antar at Hopkins and Dr. Michael Peluso at UCSF. We have an AMFAR study to look at long COVID in our HIV populations, and we're just now analyzing all that data. I think you've heard some of the work presented at CROI this year from Dr. Peluso at UCSF on some of that interactions. We do see from the basic side, and we have published on it, many of the microbial translocation markers, especially beta-D-glucan, is elevated in long COVID, and we've published that recently. We see that as well in our HIV population. So in looking at that intersection between aging, HIV, and long COVID, there are some common biomarkers and maybe some common pathways that we can approach in terms of thinking about how we might intervene with that. But I would agree from Serena that the definitions of long COVID are still very not well integrated in the field. And I know there's a lot of effort trying to, how do we define long COVID overall, and especially how it's affecting aging and HIV. So I think there's a lot of effects that may be a culmination of a perfect storm of HIV, aging, and long COVID coming to inflammation, all contributing.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Spudich, Dr. Landay. Yes, you already answered my question. Thanks.
Eve, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious. Is there any study about cultural differences in aging with HIV? What factors could impact aging in terms of cultures? Cultures meaning ways of life, diets, and this kind of thing. I mean, do people in the United States age and have a similar lifespan as the ones in other countries, for instance?
Well, I'll take that a little bit. There's a lot of research showing that exercise and good diet, and good diet means has to be defined. But good diet and exercise can reduce cardiovascular disease, can reduce inflammation, and can have all sorts of benefits. So there's no question in my mind that, and it's not just exercise, but physical activity, walking, even 10 minutes walking can improve all of those things. But more exercise is probably better if you can do it. And I'm sure Dr. Erlandson and Landay have a lot to say about that too.
There was at the Geroscience Summit that Alan mentioned at the NIH a couple of weeks ago, there was a really interesting session from one of the speakers who's been doing research. I think it was in Bolivia, on this population that lived basically off the land in the rainforest. And it was super interesting to see how different their risk of cardiovascular disease was. Just exercising. They weren't out going for a run, but just being active and getting kind of an average of 20,000 steps a day. And they had zero cardiovascular disease, like just super interesting. And I think, as Jules mentioned, there's definitely populations that with diet, we have these kind of areas around the world, like in Sicily, or not Sicily, somewhere in near Italy and Japan, that have these kind of sectors of places where people live for much longer than expected. So I think there certainly is a role for culture. Blue zones, that's what I was trying to, it was like green zones, but I knew that wasn't it. Thanks, Jeff. The blue zones where people live for much longer than expected. So absolutely.
And as Jeff mentioned, we're studying this in Brazil and other parts of the world. I think there's a lot of interest now globally. The International AIDS Society is taking this up, and we are starting to discuss more globally how our HIV populations. I think that's a critical question. I think diet is very critical, and exercise and how we do. And as Jules pointed out, that's absolutely part of it. And we're starting to look at the HIV populations as well across the world, and asking about aging in a much more effective way. And I think cultural differences are very much in play here, because your diets in Brazil aren't the same as we have in the US or in India or in China. So we have to look at all these factors in playing in how we think about HIV and aging on a global basis.
And we all have a different sense of discipline as well.
Exactly.
Well, and I would add that there are other factors involved too that I would call cultural, and that is lifetime trauma, lifetime discrimination, what neighborhood you were brought up in, lifetime education are all critical factors in aging.
Oh, that's absolutely true, Jules. And we study the socioeconomic. If you look on the L-stop from my own institution, your lifespan actually goes down 20 years, 2 stops away from the city of Chicago down into a different neighborhood of lower socioeconomic status. This has been studied by investigators here in the health equity space. So it's absolutely true within our inner cities in the US, and I'm sure true in New York as in Chicago. These are critical factors we have to study everywhere.
And I'm sure Serena knows all the data that was at Croy on this from the St. Louis group. They studied it and they presented it at Croy, showing a connection with a cognitive impairment and all these issues, specifically neighborhoods,
right?
That I think maybe it's 2 minutes after 2. We are losing people, and I just want to say thank you. I think it was a wonderful idea to pick the presenters and speakers that we did. We want to thank you so much. I think it's really important to set the stage for what's going to come next, and with regard to HIV cure research for the different long-term survivor populations. But I wanted to say that I put something in the chat that Richard Jeffries did from the Treatment Action Group, which is his latest information sheet on HIV cure research, which is just fabulous. And I also put in a file that lists the DAIDs, that's NIAID, the Division of AIDS, their CAB directory. And in the CAB directory, there is contact information for all these different community advisory boards across the country for cure, vaccine, and clinical trials. So if you're interested, please just get in touch with people, because it's people aren't dying every day like they used to, thank God. But that also means that there are not as many activists as there used to be. So, Jeff, would you like to close it up for us?
Sure. Well, again, just thank you everyone for joining, and especially to our presenters. I know you have another call that started a couple of minutes ago for the ACDG, so we'll let you go. And thank you again. And so everybody knows we did record this, and we'll be sharing the recording once it's available. So look for that. And I posted in the chat flyer for the upcoming webinars in this series that we've all put together. So thank you again, everyone. We really appreciate you joining.
And I forgot, the next one is on June the 13th, and it'll be Jeff and I doing an actual intro to cure research. And we have Michael Peluso, who Alan mentioned, that's going to be talking about some of the age limitations in clinical trial enrollment, and the actual criteria for the protocols. So thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you so much.
Have a wonderful
Thank you
day.
so much.
Thank you again. Thank you for
Bye-bye.
inviting me.